Book of Equanimity, also known as the Book of Serenity, Case 28, Gokoku's Three Shames. Preface to the Assembly. The person without clothing is indeed a naked heretic. The person who doesn't chew a grain of rice is for sure the burn-faced demon king. Even if you were born in a holy place, you can't avoid falling from the top of the pole. Is there anything to cover up this shame? The main case. Attention! A monk asked Gokoku, "When a crane stands upon a withered pine, what then?" Gokoku said, "On the ground below, it's a shame." The monk then said, "When dripping water freezes, what then?" Gokoku replied, "After sunrise, it's a shame." The monk then said, "At the time of Esho's persecution of Buddhism, where were the good gods to protect the Dharma?" Gokoku said, "For the two guardians of the Triple Gate, it's a shame." Appreciative reverse. Vigorous in the prime of life, one's temples are not yet grey. A man who doesn't exert himself is not awarded nobility. Instead, recall the family members of unbroken honour. The brook for washing ears is not for watering the ox. So this is the other collection of koans, not the Mumonkan, the Wumenkan, not the Blue Cliff record. The Book of Equanimity, Book of Serenity, was primarily used within the Soto tradition. It's the least known of the three great collections, and to be honest, I hadn't really registered this case until recently, but it just seemed relevant to so much of what we've actually been talking about recently. There's three parts to it: the preface, the main case, and the appreciatory verse. Often in the discussions I just stick with the main case because that seems to hold the core. And yet I think in both the preface and the verse here there are actually really interesting hints as to how we might take it. And it's a complex and layered koan. In one level, cutting to the heart of it. Well, I suppose in all levels, cutting to the heart of it. And therefore, hopefully, once we get a little bit more into it, grabbing us by the heart, grabbing us by our mind and our emotions. Because that's what it's about. And yet, of course, the language here is perhaps more obscure even than usual. You know, if we want to take one of the best known koans, does the dog have Buddha nature? No. Okay, work with that. Yeah, but here there's a lot to work with. So let's go back to the main case. We'll start there and then we'll use the others to tease it out. Attention! A monk asked Gokoku, "When a crane stands upon a withered pine, then what?" This is a very traditional, poetic Chinese image. The crane, elegant, noble bird, silent by and large, stands upon a withered pine. And we can easily read this as a symbol, a poetic evocation of an experience of emptiness, of realization to some degree. I have experienced the withering of the pine. I am now immaculate, poised like the crane. And what does the master say? Well, from the ground, it's a shame. So where's the shame here? Well, to some extent he's saying, well, if that's the best you got, come on, this old Chinese verse. And what are you going to do next? What are you going to do after that? To come back to Joku's phrase, and then what? The crane has to leave the pine. It has to feed. It has to do crane stuff. It can't just stand there nobly posed. So if that's the best you've got, whatever the experience, whatever the realization that you think you've had, don't stay there, or it's a shame. And for everybody on the ground. Okay, so then the monk comes back. The monk then said, when dripping water freezes, what then? And again, we can see this as another image, another metaphor, when dripping water freezes. And this is about stillness, finding stillness, command, discipline over the body, discipline over the mind, cutting off thought, cutting off sensation, cutting off movement, being immaculate, peaceful, perfect stillness. The achievement, the fruit of my practice. And then what? Gokoku replied, after sunrise, it's a shame. What happens when the sun comes out? Ice melts, water flows. Water is life. Life continues. Now there's a subtle difference between this and the first part of the case. In the first part of the case, it sounded like we were almost blaming the student. You know, you fool, you think you've got something, you can't stay there, you've got to move. Here there's no hint of blame, there's no hint of fault. The sun's going to come out. You're an idiot if you think you can stay frozen in the sunshine, but, you know, this is impermanence. And in fact, the relationship between impermanence and the emptiness we had in the first part is what this koan's all about. Impermanence, things change. Life is a flow, life is an energy, life is a force. Don't think that you can hold. Don't think that you can clamp your claws onto the pine. It's not going to work. And when the sun comes out, you're just going to melt anyway. Realise this. And obviously in both these parts, we're talking about a separation from life. No, I've now had this experience. No, I've now got this mastery. I'm now separate. Separate from what? Well, actually, separate from all of the stuff that I came to Zen practice for. Separate from my suffering, my life, the world, change. And the koan's saying, well, yeah, so what? That's not a thing. That's just going to change. What's the fundamental truth of Buddhism? It just changed. Now this is where it takes a really interesting turn, both more complex and more simple. And the way that this story is often talked about is, you know, in the kind of classic idiot monk, and the master says something, ha 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 ha, clever, points out the monk's idiocy. And in some collections, some of the time, the monk has great enlightenment. In the Book of Serenity, that doesn't so much happen. It's, well, The monk missed it, but whatever, the master had it. But I think that's not such a good way of looking at this koan. For me, this koan is more like Morecambe and Wise. It's the funny man, the comedian. And he needs his stooge, he needs a straight man. So for me, the monk's more the straight man here. And kind of either he divines, just senses where the conversation might go, in which case he's a pretty smart monk, or we knew this was going here all along, because this is where it gets interesting. In a sense, we know that anyway, don't we? Of course you can't stay still. Of course we don't just sit in our achievement, our attainment. Well, we should know that anyway. This is where it gets interesting. The monk then said, at the time of Esho's persecution of Buddhism, where were the good gods to protect the Dharma? Gokoku said, for the two guardians of the Triple Gate. It's a shame. Okay, so this refers to a historical 9th century major but very short-lived persecution of Buddhism within China. The emperors were often into Buddhism, endowed monasteries, gave grants of land, had senior Buddhist teachers at court. Fantastic. And then they decided that they were getting too powerful. These crazy Buddhists just had too much land, they had too much money, they had too much influence. Or the Confucians, or the Taoists. This is politics, this is pure politics. Would gain ascendancy at the court. And no, we're abolishing Buddhism within China. And this happened with astonishing regularity. The idea that, Chinese Buddhism just sits there and evolves is just not like that, all over the place. So this is one of the great historically known about persecutions. Apparently 4,000 monasteries were destroyed. Countless monks and nuns disrobed, sent back to where? Their original villages, just marched off into the countryside. This is major. This is real major suffering going on. Where were the good gods to protect the Dharma while all this was going on? Of course, in practice, a year later, the emperor was dead. The persecution ended. Buddhism recovered, but it had changed. It was a subtly different Buddhism. And is often pointed out, persecutions like this actually often benefited Zen or Chan as it then was, because this didn't rely on immense monasteries, on the kind of institutional paraphernalia that a lot of the Buddhist schools did. It tended to be practiced in more obscure locations by smaller communities. Many of them probably hadn't heard even of the dissolution of the Buddhist monasteries before it was all over. Back to business as usual. But that's not the point here. In bad times, in hard times, where were the guardians of the Triple Gate? Well, the guardians of the Triple Gate are the two, Buddhist god defender figures who stand by the three gates to the temple. They divide inside from outside, the holy place from the lay world. They're designed to scare off evil spirits, welcome in good practitioners. They regulate. So where were they? How did they let all this happen? So we've suddenly gone from a monk's personal achievements, look at me, I'm cool, to the world. And for a Buddhist, the worst thing that can happen in the world of practice, completely implodes. It's destroyed. When the worst has happened, then what? This is the exact opposite of my personal little achievement, my personal little insight. When the world collapses, then what? It's a shame. It's complicated. Did all the monks and nuns simply cease to be Buddhist, simply cease to be a part of Buddhism? Is Buddhism, is Zen reliant on bricks and mortar, on gold leaf, fancy carving? Is it even reliant on the sutras? What's it actually reliant on? Was the Dharma destroyed by this? Well, no. But it changed, like life, like the sun coming out and melting the ice, like the crane flying off. And what's the point of saying it's a shame? Is he really just saying, oh, it's a pity? Or is he saying, no, you, O monk, have failed. The gate guardians have failed. And this is maybe where it gets more interesting still. I mean, in terms of the gate guardians, they're separating out inside from outside, holy from secular, spiritual from everyday. And of course, even that's a separation, isn't it? And in fact, in some way, that's another failure. That's another foolishness to imagine that we've got all the holy on this side and all the not holy on that side. And so let's come back to what we, each of us here now, are not happy with, are wanting to stay separate from, are wanting our practice to separate us out from, either consciously or quite possibly unconsciously. I came across another commentary on this koan, which is by James Ford. He's talking about the melting of the ice. I think with that the student has a glimpse of the matter at a deeper level. Certainly the question turns in another direction. Yeah, I think that's important. Here, all the hurt is revealed. What shame really is. He asks about when our loved ones are murdered and our way is crushed under the heel of tyrants. When we find no place to rest our head, when all that is holy seems to drain away from us, like water swirling and disappearing down a sink. When, as it says in the original, the guardians have abandoned us, or as we might more comfortably say in Western and American culture, when God has left us and our children die. What about the matter then? A real question. And Ford grew up as a Baptist. He ended up as a Unitarian as well as a Zen teacher, so he says. And my Baptist heart resonates with the Master, who sings from the heart of it all the deep truth that turns nothing away, on both sides. Great open, and the great mess, there is only shame. So on this lovely morning when the sky breaks blue and the radio whispers a snowstorm is on its way in the next hours, what about then? What about now? What is your shame? What doesn't turn away? How are you free? And if we might get stuck in airy notions, in the wonder of, as he says, the great openness, emptiness, enlightenment, stillness, and the great mess. Our life as it is, both the bits we love and the bits which we do anything to avoid, to turn away from. It's a reminder that if we think our practice is going to end this, is going to take us to a place that is separate from our suffering, that is other than our suffering, well, to think that probably is a shame. Let's just go back to the preface. The person without clothing is indeed a naked heretic. The image of emptiness isn't going to get us anywhere. Even our little experiences just leave us not understanding. The person who doesn't chew a grain of rice is for sure the burn-faced demon king. So what do? Do we just give up? What's the point of practice if it's not going to get us somewhere? Well, no. Practice is practice. Practice is practice. We have to do it. We have to do the work, even though there's nowhere to go. Cooking rice is a great image for realization, crops up over and again. But we have to chew it too. Even if you were born in a holy place, you can't avoid falling from the top of the pole. The top of the pole is this experience of perfection, the perfection of this moment, emptiness, the realization, enlightenment. But we come back to the world. We have no option but to come back to the world, because that's what we are. No separation. There is nowhere else to go. And we can't avoid falling from the top of the pole. There's no inside and outside, no safe and unsafe, no holy and profane. There's only non-separation, and our practice in this moment and this moment and this moment. Vigorous in the prime of life. This is not about being a wizened old pine. Our temples are not yet grey. A man who doesn't exert himself is not awarded nobility. You have to practice, you have to do the work. You can't rest, you can't stay. There is no alternative. Instead, recall the family members of unbroken honour, which is taking us back to the koans, our teachers, Buddha. The brook for washing ears is not for watering the ox. That's an important cautionary note. The brook for washing ears, we wash our ears to gain clarity, to hear the world in all its richness, all its detail, to hear the Dharma. Perhaps without clean ears, no realization, no understanding of the Absolute. The brook for washing ears is not for watering the ox. If we think about where the ox will drink, it's muddy. All these cattle, all these feet stirring up the mud. This is confusion, obscurity, what Ford's calling the great mess. And yet both are water, both are life, both are essential. We shouldn't get them confused. Within non-separation, there is still difference. There is infinite difference within the non-separation of the whole. How do we live as this? How do we practice as this? Let's just go back to Ford's questions. So on this lovely morning when the sky breaks blue and the radio whispers a snowstorm is on its way in the next hours, what about then? What about now? What is your shame? Oh, perhaps it doesn't have to be shame in that sense. Perhaps it's anger. Perhaps it's fear. Perhaps it's trauma. Perhaps it's whatever. What is your shame? What doesn't turn away? How are you free? And how, in this moment, and this moment, and this moment, do I hold all of this whole, all of this me, all of this world?